the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. Okay, it's so much cooler in here than it is outdoors. I don't have air conditioning up in the office, so good. All right, well, today we kind of just passed the halfway mark in our Summer with the Saints series. So today we're moving into saint number 4, and that saint is Theodora of Byzantium. Theodora the Armenian, she's known as. And we're going to talk about her as an example of women in power in Byzantium, in the Orthodox Church. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. So again, we're talking about 6 saints during the course of the summer. That's 25% of the total that will be up in our ceiling vault. And we now have all of those saints' drafts or sketches on our bulletin board right around the corner there, so everyone can see that bulletin board, and you'll find Theodora up there. So we'll be talking about her today. We've already talked about Olaf of Norway, and we've talked about Catherine of Alexandria, and we just 2 weeks ago talked about Basil of Caesarea. So today it's Theodora of Byzantium. So Theodora, like all the other saints I'm talking about, obviously has an historical context for her life. She lived at a certain time in the history of the Orthodox Church, and so it's very interesting to consider the time she lived in and what was going on at that time. So that's what I like, as always, to do first, is talk a little bit about that historical context, and then talk a little bit about why she's remembered as a saint, why she's canonized and venerated as a saint in the Orthodox Church. So before I launch into that, are there any questions, maybe based on earlier talks or anything like that? Yeah, Terry.
Just one question. Who's the panakita for today?
So today we're doing a memorial service panakita for 3 people. We'll be doing it for the 2 that I had to reschedule from last Saturday. And those are, not Janet, what's her name? Nancy was her baptismal sponsor. She was down in California. What's that?
Tracy?
Tracy, thank you. Tracy Elizabeth. Yeah. Patty Larget, those are both from last week. And then this week, we're doing the 40th day panakita for the newly departed Michael, baptized just a couple days before his death. Yeah. So his 40th day was this past week. Yeah, that's what we're doing. Okay, all right, so let's jump in then. And yes, that's a good reminder. We have a panakita scheduled at 5:30, so I'm going to have to make a kind of hard stop just a few minutes before that to make sure I get in there, get the sensor started and all that stuff. Okie dokie, well, so Theodora's Byzantium then is the first part of what I want to talk about. So remember last time I talked about how, since Catherine's time, as I talked about Basil last time, the Roman Empire has become Christian, right? So 4th century is that big turning point when Christianity, first under Constantine, becomes legalized, and then under one of his successors at the end of the 4th century, his name is Theodosius, becomes the official religion of the Roman state. What a radical change that brought to life in that empire. But that change was already going on, and there were other ways in which it was changing too. Yeah?
How long was the time period before Constantine, making it legal and tolerable, and then it being made the state religion?
Theodosius. I think Theodosius does this in the 380s, and Constantine's Edict of Milan is 313. So let's call it half a century, a little bit more. Mm-hmm. It is really quite swift, though. Really quite swift. And there are other changes going on.
In the church, that's lightning speed.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And but it was really for the political machinery to adjust to that, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But there's also a change in centering, the center of the empire. So you know, it'd be like, I don't know, Washington, D.C. being relocated to San Francisco or something like that. It would just completely kind of center the kind of geographical balance of civilization. What happened in the case of Byzantium, as we call it, was that the capital was no longer in Rome, in Italy, but in, well, what was once called Byzantium, a small Greek fishing village off of the Bosphorus, and that small town was greatly expanded as Constantine poured a huge amount of resources into building his new capital there, called New Rome, but it becomes also nicknamed and known as Constantinople after Constantine. So there's a complete kind of orientation eastward of the center of the empire, and that means money flows to the east, away from the west, military, the same thing, economic life, political life, all sorts of things are going on this way. So it's a really big change, and culturally speaking, it meant that the Greek East, where the Greek language was predominant, became the place where the empire and the church with her kind of established for centuries to come a real strong sense of identity. However, I want to say this, they still use the Latin language out there in Constantinople for centuries to come, and this is a very important point. All the emperors until the end, until Constantine the 11th, the last emperor, he was also named Constantine, who runs into the fray as the Muslim Turks breach the walls of Constantinople in 1453, in that tragic and definitive end to the Byzantine Empire. As Constantine the 11th ran into the fray, he and his court were still using the Latin language, as I understand it anyway. I mean, they certainly were for centuries afterward. Justinian, who belongs to the 6th century, the 500s, was definitely Latin. So there's a real continuity of identity for the Roman Empire. And the Byzantine Empire is what we call it historically. And it makes sense because soon in the 400s, the Western Roman Empire will collapse. The barbarian Alaric will invade Italy. Rome will be sacked finally after so many centuries. And there'll be a kind of a dissolution of the Roman Empire in the West, heralding what some people have called the Dark Ages, when there's kind of a collapse of civilization, things like this. That never happens in the Greek East, where all of the sophistication and power of the Roman Empire continues. It continues for centuries to come. It continues for a millennium to come. From the 300s, when Constantine built it, to the 1400s, that's 1100 years, Constantinople is an impregnable city. Never falls to any conqueror until the Latin Crusaders sack it in 1204, and then a century and a half later, two and a half centuries later, it falls to the Turks permanently. So in the Byzantine Empire, then, I want to emphasize there's a continuity of what the state is. It's still the Roman state. It's still the empire of the Romans. But it's now Christianized. Constantinople, where Theodora will rule, is a city where no pagan church and pagan temples are built. And the blood sport that was so popular in the pagan Roman Empire, the Colosseum being a monument to that blood sport, where even Christians were thrown to lions for public amusement, no such blood sport is now allowed in this Christian capital. They do have kind of entertainment, like the Hippodrome. They didn't race hippos, they raced horses. Hippo is horse in Greek. But they had horse races there, but that was, relatively non-violent. Of course, it is the occasion for the terrible Nika riots that break out under Justinian and caused the deaths of thousands of people. Kathy?
So are you saying that the political language was Latin, but was the language of the church was Greek? Is that
Yes,
correct?
that is correct. So what I meant just to say is that the official documents were written in Latin. Latin was used at court for centuries to come. And most importantly, the emperors spoke of themselves as emperors of the Romans, of the Romani, the Romans. It was the Roman Empire as far as they were concerned. There's no break. There's no break. So what that meant, and we can't get into this today so much, but what that meant was that though Christian now, and with time the emperors are expected more and more to rule like Christians, not a lot was expected of Constantine, whose baptism awaited, his deathbed. But with centuries of time passing, now the emperors are expected to rule like Christians, and so it's interesting that this continuity existed because the political values and morals of the pagan Romans were quite a bit different than the Christian Byzantines. And some of that will come out in Theodora's reign, and it's always there. And this could be said then about Byzantium as a state. It inherited rather peacefully, without a big tumultuous change, though the capital was relocated, it inherited the statecraft of the pagan Roman Empire. And so there are not big surprises for us, perhaps, that infighting in court, within the court of Constantinople, was endemic. It was always going on. There were brutal practices of poking out the eyes of your opponents at court, so that because of Roman law, a blind person could not become emperor. So if you poke out the eyes of your possible rivals, you're done. He's not going to give you any more trouble. Throwing people into dungeons and leaving them behind just to starve and suffer. Torture was certainly acceptable political practice. I mean, no one thought, no, torture's not right. We can't do that. Not so. People were murdered at court, as I may even get into a little bit today, and in the time of Theodora or just after her time. So things were really ugly. But what a surprise. They're really ugly because power was so great right there. It's the most powerful state on earth. And a lot of people wanted power. You can think of any other powerful states on earth right now where people want power, right? I mean, it's always going to attract people who want power and are ready to reject, values that were widely accepted and use their power to just gain more power. And so the case of Theodora is rather interesting because though she was not a meek, simple, kind of kindly, nice woman that just, baked cookies for people at court or something like this, nevertheless, she was in a position of great power and yet acted for the benefit of the church, for the benefit of what the church considered to be orthodoxy. And Orthodox rule. And so that's why she was ultimately canonized as a saint, and why I'm talking about her today, and why we will see her image up there in our temple, because she is a canonized saint of the church. So now let's talk in some more detail about her historical context or milieu, how things were in Constantinople and in Byzantium in the time when she lived. Just so you have a point of reference, Theodora reigned in the 9th century. Her actual dates of rule are from 842 to 856. 842 to 856, about 15 years total. Right there, more or less in the middle of the 9th century. Now the 9th century, I mean, every century's kind of like got interesting things going on, but the 9th century was a really interesting and also tumultuous century in the history of Byzantium and also of the Orthodox Church. It featured the first schism between Constantinople and Rome, known as the Nicolaitan Schism. In my books, in my account, a term I got from a friend at seminary. It's not my term, but usually by historians called the Photian Schism, after Patriarch of Constantinople Photios, who is also a canonized saint of the Orthodox Church, not of the Roman Catholic Church, where you have a pope during this time, Nicholas, hence Nicolaitan Schism, who's actually the one who excommunicated Photios first. He's the one who caused the schism. And we can talk about all that maybe some other time, but we really don't have time today. But that's just one big event. Often people call it the dress rehearsal of 1054, just about 2 centuries before the permanent schism that still hasn't been healed. East and West, Constantinople and Rome, ceased to be in communion with each other in this Nicolaitan schism. But many other things are going on at this time as well. This is the time when in the West, Charlemagne is ruling and conquering and creating a tremendous empire that will be recognized by the Pope of Rome, not Nicholas, but another one a little earlier, quite a bit earlier, as the Roman Empire, which is just makes the hair curl in Constantinople that the Pope of Rome would recognize a rival, sometimes on the battlefield rival, to the Byzantine Empire that has an historical continuity all the way back to the Caesars of pagan Rome. And now this upstart named Charlemagne, king of the Franks and now emperor of the Romans by the Pope's declaration, he now is recognized as the Roman emperor. Now you have 2 emperors, 2 Roman emperors, 2 Christian empires. 1 church, 2 empires? How can that be? And that's the first time there's any sense that the one empire the Byzantine Empire is no longer the kind of unquestioned political center of Christendom. So a lot of things are going on in this 9th century. We talk about other things as well. This is the century of Cyril and Methodios, who are sent to Central Europe, to the Czech lands of Central Europe, to convert the Slavs there, and do so by using their own language rather than Greek or Latin, and eventually are driven out of there, but not before they lay the foundations for a Slavonic grammar and language that would then be used when the Russians and other Slavs like the Bulgarians and Serbians convert to Orthodoxy. It's all going on in that 9th century, many other things as well. So what's going on in Theodora's Constantinople in that century? First of all, I just want to say a word about Christian statecraft. By now, by the 9th century, after 500 years, half a millennium of Christian statecraft from Constantine to this time, it is expected that the emperor or empress, in her case, will rule like a Christian. And this is now firmly established. There are all sorts of ways in which this is played out. The palace in Constantinople, where the emperors spent a lot of their time, is filled with all sorts of Christian imagery and symbolism. The Christian emperor comes to the main church, Hagia Sophia, rebuilt famously by Justinian a couple centuries earlier with its huge central dome. And now the emperor comes and he stands in a place of central importance during the Divine Liturgy, enters into the altar, the only layperson allowed into the altar during communion, to receive Holy Communion, seen as really the kind of custodian of the church, even though he's a layman, even though he's a political figure and not a bishop. Nevertheless, he's treated almost like a bishop of the church. He is the one who appoints the Patriarch of Constantinople. He is the one who calls councils, and we've had many ecumenical councils now. In fact, all 7 ecumenical councils have now taken place. We'll get to that 7th ecumenical council in a moment here. So Christian statecraft is established. When an emperor is made an emperor, either because he inherits the empire from his father, or as happened quite a lot, he's murdered his predecessor, the bishop, Patriarch of Constantinople, anoints him as emperor. Doesn't step in and say, you shouldn't have done that, power's bad, give it up and just be a nice man. But, I mean, there's just no question about this. This is like a powerful, this is just sheer power, overwhelming power. And the church, sometimes looking like a kind of a handmaiden to the state, didn't usually object, didn't step in and moralize or confront or speak truth to that power when it was violated. Human rights, slavery was everywhere to be found, east and west at this time. All sorts of social injustice was prominent in this society. Stuff that would, again, make, raise our hair on end, was going on. And the church was not running in and in a kind of, morally superior way, preaching to the leaders of the Byzantine state how they should rule. This is just not what was going on. Wouldn't happen for centuries to come. We can maybe talk about that in another context. But that was the case. Now, as far as Christian statecraft went, there was an ideal and there was a reality. Okay, the ideal was called symphony. Symphony. How many here have heard of that term applied to Christian statecraft? Symphony. So the idea is that there's a symphonic or harmonious relationship between the emperor and the patriarch of Constantinople, and in general all the bishops of the church in collegial relationship with that patriarch of Constantinople. That the political head of the state should work in symphony with the ecclesiastical heads of what was a kind of overlapping state. There was no separation of church and state. That hardly needs to be said, but we should just say it. There's no concept of that until modern times. The church and the state were one. That's what made it so hard to think of a rival Roman Empire, Christian Roman Empire, when Charlemagne creates it. There's just no way of thinking about it this way. So the emperor was part of the church. So you can't say he was the state and the church was the church. And furthermore, the church, unlike what will develop in post-schism Roman Catholic circles, the church was not the hierarchy. The church was the body of Christ, of which the emperor was a member, prominent member, but nevertheless just a member. So there's no church here and state here, and they somehow had to work out a relationship called symphony. There was a sense that they were overlapping, and the emperor served the interests of the church, and the church supported the emperor insofar as he was Christian and ruled like a Christian. That's the ideal. And there are many examples in which this ideal worked out. The reign of Justinian was not without problems and even scandals, but Justinian did a lot to build up the church. He rebuilt Hagia Sophia, I just mentioned. He passed a series of law codes that placed the church at the center of the political and social fabric of Byzantium. He wrote theological works. He called an ecumenical council together to deal with heresies. So Justinian of the 6th century, a little earlier, was a kind of an example, and he actually used the word symphony, and that historians often use that, point to him as being kind of the one who clarified this ideal of symphony. But as I say, there was a reality too. There was a shortcoming often, a distortion of this ideal, and that distortion came many, many centuries later in the West to be called Caesaro-papism. Caesaro-papism. From the word Caesar, meaning emperor or ruler, and papism, which at this time didn't exist. There was no papism. But the idea of papism is that the Pope has supreme authority over the state and over everyone else. And so the idea of Caesaro-papism is a distortion of that symphony where the emperor becomes a pope and has absolute rule over everyone and forces religious policies on the church to the detriment of the church. Okay? And so this is Caesaro-papism. As I say, it's an incoherent term because there was never papism in Orthodoxy, or even up until this time there wasn't papism. So it just doesn't make sense, but it more or less serves, so I use it, even though it doesn't make sense. So there we go. So symphony and Caesaro-papism. Now, these were both behind the most immediate and important point of context for Theodora's reign, which was called iconoclasm. We all know about that. And in fact, when we're going to be talking momentarily about the event in Theodora's reign that Orthodox Christians remember every year on the first Sunday of Great Lent, known as the Triumph of Orthodoxy, the restoration of the icons. That's what Theodora is most known for. So before she comes to power, about a century before she comes to power, there has started and has really advanced a movement to destroy all the icons in the world, really, but especially in the political boundaries of the Byzantine Empire. This is called iconoclasm, from the Greek word icon, smashing, to smash icons, to destroy icons. Now, this all started in the early 700s or 8th century in the case of an emperor named Leo III. Leo III was one of the emperors that preceded Theodora. Leo III became emperor, but he had grown up in the Syrian borderlands of the Byzantine Empire. Now they're borderlands. Before they had not been, but in the 600s and 700s they become borderlands because one great power has conquered those territories. What great power do you think that is? Islam, the Arab Islamic State. So what happens is Islam comes exploding out of Arabia and conquers basically southern Byzantium, to put it this way, southern Byzantium. By the 700s, all of North Africa, which was once Byzantine, Egypt, for instance, which was Byzantine, all of North Africa, Palestine, Syria, and parts of Anatolia, what will become Turkey, have all been conquered by this explosive militant religion, Islam, okay, under the Arabs. I emphasize the Arabs because another ethnic group will come later on, not the Arabs, but the Turks, and will continue the military expansion of Islam, and it's they who conquer Constantinople in 1453. Right now it's just the Arabs. So they conquer all of that territory. They conquer the territory that includes Jerusalem and Antioch and Alexandria, and these three areas are, of course, three of the historic patriarchates of the church, to which are added, and first in position, Rome, and secondly, New Rome or Constantinople. So this is very disruptive to the normal life of the Byzantine Empire and the church in general. But it's a reality. It's just a political reality. Now, when he comes to power, this Leo III that I mentioned in the early 700s is just kind of, everyone was just overwhelmed by the loss of such a tremendous territory. The land where Jesus, had ministered, had gone to his death and resurrection, Jerusalem and its environs, gone. The Holy Sepulchre there, the Church of the Resurrection, gone, and so on and so forth. Bethlehem, all these holy places, gone. And it was a shock. Now, as emperor, coming from the Syrian borderlands of the Byzantine Empire, Leo III reflected on this unstoppable power of Islam. And it seems, he never wrote this down, he didn't write his autobiography or something like that. We don't really know. We have to kind of piece it together and speculate, okay? But it seems like he drew the conclusion that God allowed this to happen for some sin, some shortcoming of the Christians, of the Byzantine Christians. Why did he allow this to happen? Who knows? But how can we make sense of all of this? Unstoppable conquest. And what he concluded is that Islam teaches against the use of icons, against images, categorically, strictly. And Islam does this. Islam was, of course, quite influenced by not only Christianity, but especially Judaism, in the crossroads that were Mecca and Medina. And so there's a lot of Jews and Christians that Muhammad had learned from and talked to, and everyone's always observed this. I mean, there's no question about this. Islam has a lot of, kind of non-Islamic elements in it, you might say, coming from Judaism and even Christianity. So anyway, he concluded, apparently, we don't really know this, but it seems like he may have concluded, that the reason why God allowed Byzantium to be conquered was that Byzantium was doing something religiously offensive to God. And this was painting icons and using them for veneration. And as he did this, of course, his thoughts came to the second commandment. The second commandment, which says, you will make no graven images. I'll just read it to you really fast. It's from the book of Exodus, chapter 25. I'm sorry, chapter 20. And this is what that says. Pardon me. It's Exodus 20, verse 2. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods than me. Verse 4, 24. You shall not make for yourself an idol or a likeness of anything in heaven above or in the earth beneath or in the waters under the earth. Okay, you shall not bow down to them and so forth. So what seems to be a pretty, categorical commandment against what came to be known as images or icons. So that's something that Leo kind of fastened himself to and said, we've made a terrible mistake. And he was influenced by Islam because in those lands conquered by the Muslims, there were periodic efforts to eradicate in the Christian churches all the icons that accumulated over the centuries. And so this is what Leo concludes as he launches what we call iconoclasm, a systematic effort to destroy and eliminate the use of icons in Christian worship. His successor is named Constantine, I think it's the fifth. He gets the nickname Kapronimos. You want to know what that word means? Okay, Reader Vladimir. Well, since you know what it is, you just tell us, and I don't have to do
As
it.
cleaned up as I can do it, basically, poop name.
Okay, that's not bad.
Very unpleasant incident when he was being baptized as a child.
In the font.
Yes.
Okay, now we have to also say our we have very little information from that whole period of time, right? Like centuries and centuries. So a lot of reviling took place after someone who was hated. So who knows? I mean, I don't know if this really happened or it was just his enemies that said this of him. But anyway, that's what he got named as Constantine Kapronimos, and he continued his father Leo III's policy of iconoclasm, even called together a council that declared itself ecumenical, that reviled the use of icons and said they are the work of Satan, and we need to destroy icons. This is a council. It's a council of Hiria. It gathers in the 1750s in Chalcedon, across from Constantinople, and this is a council that's held, and people come together for it. None of the patriarchates were there at this time, though the emperors had placed iconoclast patriarchs in Constantinople. It was vacant at that moment. So this council is sometimes called the Headless Council, because none of the patriarchates sent delegates to this council. Terry.
You said 1750, you meant 750 or?
Sorry, 750.
Yeah, I just want to.
Very good. Yeah, thank you. As a matter of fact, let me give you the date since it's come up here. 754. 754, yeah. So this is just the most sophisticated effort to do that, to advance iconoclasm on a theological basis. You can actually read some of its statements. They're quite categorical and quite theologically sophisticated. A patriarch, someone who will become patriarch of Constantinople, another iconoclast, named John the Grammarian, helps formulate the theological language. So it's a robber council or false council, even though it declares itself ecumenical. And so this is going on in the case against icons throughout the 8th century, the 700s. The emperors mostly support iconoclasm. After Kapronimos passes, there's a kind of a reversal of this that culminates in the 7th Ecumenical Council. And that 7th Ecumenical Council, in quick summary, says no, icons are appropriate and even necessary in the life of Christian worship, and to reject icons, and certainly to destroy them, is to subvert the central Christian doctrine that God became human in Jesus Christ. Because if you cannot paint an image, render an image of God made man, you are subverting the doctrine of the incarnation. To say you cannot do this because God is immaterial is to reject the fact that he became matter. And they pointed, the defenders of icons during this time, people like John of Damascus, they pointed to Scripture. And it's quite interesting, catechumens get this from me, because sometimes people come from maybe a Protestant background, thinking like, what is this? I've never seen icons used, and I've heard, the second commandment. I just read the second commandment. It's pretty categorical, pretty obvious what's going on here. But the same scripture, 5 chapters later, Exodus chapter 25, has the following to say. Verse 17 and following, God says, "You shall also make a mercy seat of pure gold on the Ark of the Covenant, the holiest thing on earth. 2.5 cubits, we don't have to worry about what its size shall be its length, and when you make two, and then you shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Of hammered work you shall make them at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end and the other at the other end. You shall make the cherubim of 2 ends of it one piece with the mercy seat. They shall stretch out their wings, their material wings, and so forth." And then a little bit later, chapter 26 goes on to say that artistically rendered images or icons of these cherubim should be put on the temple veil as well. Chapter 26. "Now shall you make the tabernacle with 10 curtains of fine woven linen, with blue, purple, scarlet fabric." In other words, colors matter. Visual, sensual colors are part of God's plan here. "And you shall weave them with artistic designs of cherubim." Artistic designs. Art. Sanctified art in the worship of God. What do we call that? We call that liturgical art. Liturgical art. So, read in context then, that second commandment is not so categorical and is understood by the fathers reflecting on iconoclasm. Remember, every theological clarification often requires a heresy to disrupt and subvert orthodoxy for the church to be able to reflect on what that heresy is and why we believe what we believe. And so fathers like John of Damascus wrote during this whole period about why icons are an important part of our faith, and how the matter created by God, the material world, is his creation and is sanctified by the incarnation. So this is what John of Damascus wrote about this time. "In former times, God, who is without form or body," in other words, the God who communicated with the Jews in the Old Testament, there had been no incarnation yet, "could never be depicted. But now, when God is seen in the flesh conversing with men, I make an image of the God whom I see. I do not worship matter, I worship the Creator of matter, who became matter for my sake, who willed to make his abode in matter, who worked out my salvation through matter. Never will I cease honoring the matter which brought my salvation. I honor it, but not as God." That's John of Damascus in a summary of what he said. And I have the book here, but I see we're running out of time, so I'm not going to read to you the statement of the Seventh Ecumenical Council and its fathers, but it states that we have always been open to the veneration of icons in the church, and iconoclasm is a great heresy and anathema upon anyone who says we cannot make icons, because by doing so, they subvert the doctrine, the saving doctrine, the centrally Christian doctrine of the incarnation. And so this is what is the going on before Theodora comes to power. Now let's get to her reign with 15 minutes left. But context is everything when it comes to history, and so it's worth knowing that context. So the reign of Theodora lasts from 842 until 856, about 15 years in the middle of the 9th century. And she comes to power because she was married to an emperor who dies. His name is Theophilos. Theophilos is just one of many, many emperors who comes to power. But Theophilos is one of those emperors who has recently come to power and has reimposed, despite the Seventh Ecumenical Council, reimposed iconoclasm. Has overseen the placement of an iconoclastic patriarch as ecumenical patriarch. And this is that John the Grammarian I mentioned earlier. Very sophisticated and accomplished a literary figure, theologian, and so forth. That's why he gets his nickname, the Grammarian. Theophilos has brought him to power, has reimposed iconoclasm with something of a difference. Constantine Copronymus and Leo III were ready to disrupt everything and kill people that got in their way, and now they're much more mellow about iconoclasm. Iconoclasm is the official policy, but if you're going to venerate an icon in your bedroom or something like that, like whatever, we're not going to creep up on you and catch you doing that. Although he did actually do that once in the case of Theodora and scolded her, but he let her go. She said, "Oh, I was just looking at the mirror, and your servant came in and saw me looking." The court jester comes and finds her venerating an icon in her bedroom, according to one account once. And she was called before her husband, the emperor, and said, like, "What are you doing? This is not acceptable." And she said, "Actually, I was just venerating. I was sitting with some friends, and the mirror reflected one of my friends sitting behind me, and I kissed the image of the friend." It's like a bunch of nonsense, obviously, but somehow you let it go. He just wasn't going to persecute people on a big scale, even though he was an iconoclast. Well, the thing is, he dies, and we don't need to know anything more about Theophilus. He dies. And that leaves her in power, because their son, and it was normative for a man to reign in Byzantium, in the Roman Empire. But what's interesting about Christendom is women, made in the image and likeness of God equally with men, have now been placed, have at certain points in the history of the Byzantine state, been given power as empresses in ways that never would they have been given power in pagandom, in the pagan Roman Empire. Now, this principle that women should not rule under any circumstances had not yet been accepted in the West. As a matter of fact, the Seventh Ecumenical Council of 787 had been called by the female ruler, Empress Irene, along with her son, her co-ruler. And it was Charlemagne and all of his Frankish theologians who just went crazy because this woman is ruling in Constantinople. A woman can't rule. That's absolutely unacceptable to the Franks, to the Western Franks. And actually, the acceptance of the decision of the Ecumenical Council was delayed in the West because it occurred under a female ruler. Well, in the East, it's a little bit less controversial to have a female ruler, and so she was accepted for about 15 years as the empress, especially because her son of both Theophilus and her, Michael III, soon to be Michael III, he's quite a piece of work. Well, he was just 2 years old, so obviously he's not going to reign. So Empress Theodora comes to power, and she begins to reign. But the first thing she does, and the thing we're most concerned with, is she decides that she's not going to allow this kind of waffling about the Seventh Ecumenical Council. Now, quite more than a generation earlier, it's like more than 50 years before. She is going to reassert orthodoxy and reestablish icon veneration, which she had been doing the whole time herself because she always was an icon venerator. Iconodule is kind of the technical term in the political literature for one who venerates an icon rather than destroys an icon. Iconoclast destroys them, iconodule venerates them. But she was an iconodule, and so was the people around her at court. And so she deposes Patriarch John the Grammarian and places a persecuted former patriarch, persecuted because he was an iconodule, he venerated icons, his name is Methodios, on the patriarchal throne. And that sets things up so the church, here we go again with like symphony, remember? The power of the ruler is supporting what's understood to be orthodoxy, correct Christian practice. And so she appoints Methodios as patriarch, and Methodios now sets a date for a council 1 year after the death of Theophilus to be held in Constantinople, in Hagia Sophia, to restore icons formally. And so that council was held on the first Sunday of Lent, 843. Happens to be March 11th, 843. There's a solemn icon procession with her participating in it from the famous church of Blackernay, kind of north part of Constantinople to the south, where Hagia Sophia is located in the central political center of Constantinople. They enter Hagia Sophia. Just swarms of people are there. They're all holding icons as they walk through the streets, like, in your face to the iconoclasts. And now there's a special service where anathemas are read against all the iconoclasts of the past, and including the emperors. Not her husband. She insisted that he not be anathematized, but all the other emperors, especially those two I mentioned, Leo III and Constantine Copronymus, are anathematized in what's called the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, by which is clearly stated that icons are a legitimate part of Christian life and Christian worship, and to reject icons is to enter the schism, enter the heresy of iconoclasm, and to be anathematized. So this happens on that first Sunday of Great Lent, and as we all know, in parish life, it continues every year since then. Every single year since then, it was repeated, that commemoration of what comes to be known as the triumph of orthodoxy. Now, it starts off just as a Hagia Sophia Constantinople thing in the first years, but with time it spreads to other churches throughout the capital, and then throughout the empire, and then with other lands convert, like the Russians convert. That's still up ahead in history. They adopt this practice too, and so today every Orthodox church on the planet, the first Sunday of every Great Lent, calls that day the Sunday of Orthodoxy, and has usually has some commemoration. Certainly the hymnography commemorates this event, this restoration of icons. Sometimes an excerpt of the Synodicon of Orthodoxy is read, which actually is built right into this, the repeating of the words of the Seventh Ecumenical Council. This is the faith of the apostles, this is the faith that establishes the whole universe, that kind of thing. The symbol of the faith is read. Sometimes anathemas are read. Sometimes many years are said for Christian rulers and this kind of thing. So that's the origin, then, of the triumph of Orthodoxy in 843, the second year of the reign of Empress Theodora. So maybe just to wrap things up here, what happened after this woman with power no longer had power? What happened? Well, this still was a man's world, and though she was a legitimate empress by Byzantine norms, that was just because there was no man around that could rule in her stead that was legitimate. And so people waited for her son, and also the son of Theophilus, to come to maturity. His name was Michael III. Michael III is really, as I said, quite a problematic emperor. He did not reverse iconoclasm, so that's not the thing. It was just morally, he was totally bankrupt. He was a wine bibber. He was always drunk. He's always having wild parties at the court. He was a womanizer. He always had prostitutes at the court. He began to sideline his mother, his rather holy mother. Theodora would have been shocked by all these things. So he got her kind of put out of the way. He brought in a court advisor named Bardas, or Bardas, I'm not sure how it would be pronounced. And Bardas comes in, and Bardas is looking for power himself. And so he tries to arrange for Michael to have the woman that Michael really desires available to him as a concubine. And she turns out to be the daughter of a Viking lord. The Vikings at this time are expanding, and so there's a Viking lord who's in Constantinople serving the empire. You've heard of the Varangian Guard and things like this. So he's got this beautiful girl, I think her name is Ergerina, and so Michael desires her, but he can't marry her because she's just too suspect morally. And so he arranges to have her anyway by securing her in a relationship with someone he thinks he can trust. And this person he thinks he can trust is named Basil, soon to be known as the Macedonian. You know where this is going probably. So his buddy Basil agrees to marry this girl, Ergerina, and keep his hands off her so that Michael, in the middle of the night can come by Basil's house, and they can drink, and then he can disappear into the bedroom with Basil's wife, but really treating her as his own. This is making you kind of uncomfortable. Sorry about this, but it is Byzantium, okay? It is the successor to the Roman Empire. It's reality. And so this goes on for a long time until until the girl becomes pregnant, probably by Emperor Michael's own act. And Basil sees that he has a problem now, because he's got this woman that he's married to that now has the heir to the throne. And what's going to happen to him when Michael, finally wants that heir legitimated? So Basil decides to organize a palace assassination, is what happens. He gets Michael really drunk one night with lots of women and lots of fun at the court, and then he has one of his own agents go up to the bedroom and disable the lock to the bedroom of Michael's bedchamber. So Michael goes stumbling off at the end of their drinking spree to his bedroom, thinks he locks the door, falls unconscious on his bed, and Basil accompanies a group of assassins into Michael's bedchamber, and they drag him out of his bed. They chop his hands off. I don't know why they did that. And he's begging for his life, and they finally thrust a sword into him, and he kill him this way. And now Basil, the Macedonian, becomes emperor. He becomes emperor, and he takes this girl now as his own, and he takes the child to be born of her as his own, and he becomes the next emperor. So, you can see as I started this presentation today, politics is ugly. Power is ugly, often very ugly, and it's ugly even in the capital of the world's first Christian state, Byzantium. The Christianity there often got ignored, and it was just power that people were concerned with. But for a moment, for a decade and a little bit more, there was a holy woman who held that power, Theodora, and she used her power in a way to strengthen and secure holy orthodoxy through the triumph of orthodoxy in 843. And so that's why we commemorate Theodora, Saint Theodora of Constantinople. Okay, so that's it for today. Any questions before I run off and start that censor? For the Panahida, yeah.
For the iconoclasts, when they removed the icons, did they also, did they retain a structure separating the altar from the rest of the church? And if so, what was on it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think we really know. Certainly I learned at seminary that the original iconostas, the original icon barrier, chancel barrier, didn't have icons on it. It was a very low, maybe as low as this table right here, railing that kept the altar from the main area and again allowed the clergy to do their thing in that altar area. But it wasn't high, it didn't obscure vision into the altar area or of the altar, and didn't even have icons originally. But with time, it starts to be elaborated, kind of worked out as like, hey, icons would go well here, wouldn't they? And a central passage into the altar called royal gates, that would be great. And this kind of thing happened. It was the Russians who built what my professor used to like to call the wedding cake style iconostasis, where you have multiple tiers of icon rows going up, all the way to the ceiling. But that's a much later development, and it definitely follows iconoclasm.
So what would it look like in Hagia Sophia at the time of the restoration of the icons?
Don't know. I really don't know. Yeah, I'm sure someone has made an effort to figure that out. I do recommend Hugh Wybrew's book called the Byzantine Divine Liturgy or something like that. He's an Anglican, but he's a very sympathetic one. And he tries to put together the history of the liturgy, and he might have something in there about liturgical arts and the architecture of the interior temple. And Hagia Sophia would be the only thing we have any real information about. Yeah. But it is a process. It's not from the start. Yeah. Terry.
It seems like this is probably easy to answer, but do we know if the iconoclasts were especially violent toward the iconodules?
They were, yes. It wasn't, all-out war, but some iconodules were actually killed for their.
But you would think the iconodules, because they were practicing orthodoxy, didn't retaliate when they were in power, because I know they were.
They generally did not retaliate in the same manner. Again, the violence done by iconoclasts against iconodules was not like the violence done by, like, I don't know, the Spanish Inquisition against heretics or something. It wasn't that violent, you know. But there were people who were killed and certainly punished and maimed, and we do have confessors who are saints because they suffered under the iconoclasts. But by the time of Theodora, this has created so much disruption that even her husband, the iconoclast Theophilos, he didn't want to get into violence and do that either. And so by the time Theodora comes along and the restoration occurs, they just want to move on. They just want to move on. And so actually it's a very gentle. There were some, the most severe or harsh response was excommunication and exile in some cases. Like John, the grammarian, the patriarch, I think he's exiled, but he's not harmed physically. Yeah. Any other questions before we say our prayer? Okay, it's good to see you today. So the next time, 2 weeks from now, we'll do saint number 5, and that will be, who would that be? It'll be Philip of Moscow, speaking, I spoke of this today, speaking truth to power. In the case of the bloodthirsty Ivan the Terrible, Metropolitan Philip of Moscow will confront him and say, you cannot do this because you're a Christian. And we'll see what happens to Philip as a result of that in 16th century Muscovite Russia. Okay? All right, let's say a prayer and we'll be done. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption thou gavest birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory forever.